Talk about what happened and what has not happened, and then take a look at what is likely to happen around the combination of mobile communications, the internet, and personal computers. So this started for me when I arrived in Tokyo in the spring of 2000. And in Tokyo, it's very expensive to take a taxi cab from the airport, so you take the train. When you arrive, you find yourself really immersed in Tokyo itself. You get out of the train station, you're surrounded by Tokyo, and I couldn't help notice in the spring of 2000 that people on the streets of Tokyo were doing things that were very different than what I had seen in America. Now, it probably would not have been strange for someone from Madrid or for much of the world where SMS had been used for years before we started using it in North America. But I was surprised to see so many people in Tokyo walking around looking at their telephones. Didn't know yet what this was about. And there were a lot of kind of strange sights in Tokyo for American eyes, so I didn't really think a lot about it. But I happened to be, just a few weeks later, on the other side of the world, in a very, very different culture, in Helsinki, Finland. People carry their mobile phones in their hands. And in fact, the word in Finnish for mobile telephone is the diminutive form of telephone. It's like of hand. It's like saying, did you bring your little hand with you today? So I was sitting having a cup of coffee in an outdoor cafe when 3 teenagers came by and stood right next to where I was sitting to encounter 2 older adults. Maybe they were the teacher, professor of one of them, or maybe they were parents. I really don't know because they were speaking Finnish and I don't understand Finnish. But I could not help noticing that one of the young people took his mobile phone, looked at the screen and smiled, and showed the screen to his two peers, other 2 young people, and they also smiled. But he did not show it to the 2 older adults. And the conversation continued as if this was normal. And that struck me as being very interesting, that something was happening on the streets of Tokyo and on the streets of Helsinki that was not yet happening in the streets of New York or San Francisco, where I live. So I asked my friends in Japan and in Finland what they thought was happening. And it's interesting to me that they used the same word. They said, both my Japanese friends and my Finnish friends used the same word. They said, oh, the young people today, they flock like birds. They all show up at the same fast food restaurant, or the same shopping mall at the same time, because they've been, of course, exchanging SMS messages. Now there are more than 1 trillion SMS messages exchanged worldwide every year, and it has indeed changed not just the way teenagers communicate, but the way everybody meets in cities. I really didn't start thinking that something big was happening, though, until I read about what was happening in the Philippines. You might remember that in Manila, there were political demonstrations around the Joseph Estrada regime. Estrada was the president of the Philippines, and he was accused of corruption. There were hearings in the Philippine Congress that were on their television, and everybody in the Philippines was watching these televised hearings. And at some point, the hearings were closed. They were shut down by Congress people who were associated with the Estrada regime. And at that point, something remarkable happened. Tens of thousands of people began to appear in the square, the same square where the demonstrations 10 years before that had brought down the Marcos regime. And everybody was wearing black. Because the moment those hearings were shut down, an SMS message went out that said, go to EDSA, the name of the square, and wear black to mourn the death of democracy in the Philippines. And in fact, over the next 3 days, millions of people gathered in that square peacefully. Tens of millions of SMS messages were sent. And that contributed to the fall of the Estrada regime. And it occurred to me that there's some connection between what those people on the streets of Tokyo, those teenagers in Helsinki, and these citizens in the Philippines were doing. So I started asking around about it. And I found a sociologist who used a term I had not heard before. He said, it sounds like the threshold, the barrier for collective action. It's a phrase that sociologists use to describe people doing things together. It sounds like that barrier has been lowered by the technology. People are able to do things together, to organize activities, whether they're social activities like those teenagers or political activities such as we saw in Manila, much more easily, with more people that they weren't able to organize with before, in places they weren't able to organize before, and at speeds they weren't able to organize before. So I started using the term smart mobs to describe this phenomenon in which not just the mobile phone, but the internet as well enable people to coordinate activities. And not always beneficial activities. We are seeing criminals and terrorists using these same technologies to organize their own kinds of collective action. So I'm going to show you a number of things that have happened in the world, many of them peaceful, democratic, creative, and productive, but I want to caution that there are destructive effects, just as there are with any technology. Now, 10 years ago, I thought what we were seeing with the telephone, the personal computer, and the internet beginning to combine into some new technology, some new medium that we did not yet have a name for. There was a little bit like what I saw in 1980 when the first personal computers were available. And they didn't have much capability. And people were really wondering whether ordinary people, not technicians, would want to use them. And I remember the internet when it was just letters on a screen, just black and white letters on a screen using a modem. We have to keep in mind when we see these early indicators of a technology that the technologies are going to become very much more powerful, and they're going to multiply each other's power. So the very toy-like PC of 1980 grew into very powerful computers you have in your hands on your desktops, computers that are millions of times more powerful than the ones that sent people to the moon. And the social practices that are going to emerge from these much more powerful technologies are going to be radically different 10 years from now. So in 2000, when I talked about this, I talked about the fact that we have a new medium emerging. We don't really have a name for it yet. And we're going to begin to see people using this medium in ways that the telephone has not been used as we know it. The personal computer or the internet have not been used in the ways that we know them. Now, this new medium is really becoming visible to most people. So I started looking around when I wrote this book for examples of collective action, examples of people being able to do things together in every sphere, in the technical, the social, the political, and the cultural, in ways that they weren't before. One of the first things I saw was distributed computation, is what it's called. It started with something called SETI at home. Now, SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's a large radio telescope in Puerto Rico that scans the skies and collects signals, radio signals from outer space, and turns those into digital data, which computers then search to see whether there is some kind of message, whether some kind of intelligent civilization out there is sending out messages. Well, of course, this requires a lot of computing power, and this is not something that American taxpayers want to pay for. But SETI had a very interesting idea of creating a screensaver for personal computers. If you download this screensaver and put it on your computer, when your laptop or desktop computer goes to sleep, the screensaver wakes up, it downloads some of this data that comes from outer space, it runs a simple pattern recognition program and sends its results back to SETI headquarters. Now, what was interesting to me about this was not the search for little purple people who were trying to tell us something. It was the fact that over 2 million volunteers had created what had been in effect the world's most powerful supercomputer. Those volunteers had amassed 20 teraflops of computing power. That's 20 trillion operations per second. It turns out that it's not just looking for life in outer space. If you are trying to cure AIDS or find a medicine to cure cancer, you need to understand how protein molecules fold in three-dimensional space. Protein molecules are so complex that the number of possible ways for them to fold is larger than the number of atoms in the universe. So this is far beyond the capabilities of even the largest mainframe computers. But again, folding at home enables anybody, anywhere in the world, to contribute their laptop computers to this effort. So if you go to folding.stanford.edu, you can help with this. There are other examples. There's one called Fight AIDS at Home. People are helping climate scientists do weather simulations. What we are seeing is a kind of computing that's only possible because people link their personal computers voluntarily through the internet. What kind of computation, what kind of scientific research that is impossible today are we going to see 10 years from now when we have billions of people walking around with supercomputers in their pockets or in their hands, linked at speeds far greater than what we consider to be broadband speeds today? Don't have to explain Wikipedia, but who would have thought 10 years ago, when I was first investigating this, that a few thousand volunteers would set out to create an encyclopedia free for everyone in the world in their own language. We're beginning to create knowledge together because the technology is enabling us to do so. In Korea, where the young cyber generation participated in citizen journalism, we have a website called Oh My News, in which 50,000 citizen journalists and several hundred professional editors put out a daily citizen-generated newspaper online. During the presidential elections, the candidate that was favored by these young cyber-savvy people was not favored to win and had been ignored by the mainstream press. And in fact, on election day, their candidate was losing in the election polls, in the exit polls that were taken as the vote was happening. So they put out a call on Oh My News, and they asked everybody who paid attention to it to send email to their friends, to send SMS messages to their friends, and tell them to get out and vote. And in fact, they tipped that election And President Rowe, who had not been forecast to win, gave his first interview, not to the mainstream media, not to the largest newspapers, but to Oh My News. And several months later, when the Korean Congress attempted to impeach President Rowe, they called for street demonstrations, and that's what this picture is about. I knew that something had happened in Madrid when I got up in the morning, and there were a dozen copies of this photograph in my email. I don't need to explain to you what happened here. Again, a presidential election had been tipped right after the terrorist bombings, primarily by people organizing through SMS. The Orange Revolution in the Ukraine, again, self-organized by people using the internet and their telephones. All of these so far have been peaceful and democratic demonstrations. In the US, a couple of years ago, US Congress had proposed an immigration bill, which was very controversial and might result in the deportation of a great many people. In Los Angeles, 20,000 high school students used the social network service MySpace to organize a walkout from their classes. They left their high school classes and joined demonstrations on the streets of Los Angeles. And they frightened the legislatures so badly that there is still not an immigration bill passed. I was in Santiago, Chile about a year ago, and they said, oh, we had a smart mob here. We call it the Penguin Revolution. So in Chile, the students wear uniforms that make them look like penguins. That's why they call them penguins. And the publicly funded education system in Chile is not very good. And the students themselves decided to do something about it. So they used Photolog, which is very, very popular social networking service there. They used Instant Messenger, and they used YouTube, talking about 14, 15, and 16-year-old students who not only organized a walkout, they locked the doors of the schools. And they brought tens of thousands of people, not just students, into the streets in Santiago, in Valparaiso, and other cities in Chile. The Minister of Education was forced to resign, and that began a dialogue about the funding of education in Chile that continues to this day.